So there's 3 keys to making Spencer Lee's ride work. First one is backside hip control. The second one is near side hip control. And the third one is attacking their near arm. All right. On this first breakdown, he's going to chop. And we're going to take a look at how he is using those 3 keys on his chop breakdown. All right. So we see he has a good anchor with his backside elbow on the opponent's hip. That gives backside hip control. Now with this, he's trying to lift their hip, their outside hip, higher than their inside hip. All right. Now for near hip control, he uses his front knee pretty often, which we can see right here. He's blocking their knee with his knee, which stops them from knee sliding that knee in front. If you get that knee in front, you can start to get your outside hip back down, which is what he doesn't want to happen. Right, and then he's attacking the near arm with a chop. So we'll continue this breakdown out. So as he starts to chop, and here he gets his hip really high over his inside hip, chops him right down to his shoulder for his breakdown. Here, this is the way this position looks right now is pretty often of what you'll see as he's breaking the guy down. So he's got backside hip control. This hip, this outside hip is higher than their inside hip. All right, and he's got the inside hip controlled with either his knee, or he does some things with his feet. Sometimes it'll control their near leg, and then he attacks the arm with a chop or a head lever or an elbow push. Here we're going to see similar things. 3 keys are still going to exist, but this time he is going to head lever. So as we start the clip, still got backside hip control. And he's trying to take that backside hip higher than his opponent's inside hip. Here we see there's virtually no near hip control on this side, blocking the opponent's inside knee or leg. You see the opponent start to try and rotate their knee up to get their outside hip back down. All right, so he feels this happening. He brings his knee back in front to start to push or block their knee back out from getting any more height back into him. And of course, he's attacking their arm with a head lever here. And as he attacks, again, this is a similar looking position to the last one as he breaks him down, where we can see their backside leg kind of float in the air as they get broken down. This is due to the backside hip control, which again I think is the most important part of this whole ride. All right, here we're going to see his last breakdown, which is elbow push. All right, so again, he has backside elbow control, trying to get that outside hip higher than their inside hip. And front knees looking to block and control their near hip. Now, opponent drops to an elbow here as he goes to chop or head lever. So he transitions into just attacking their arm with an elbow push, where he pushes their arm straight out in a way. And again, you can see this leg high on the backside, really emphasizing the back hip lift with his elbow. So those are the 3 keys to making the ride work. Backside hip control and trying to get that hip higher than their inside hip. And near side hip control, so they can't get their knee in front and use their knee or foot to block and control that hip, and then attacking their arm in one of three ways: either chop, head lever, or elbow push. Okay, now let's take a look at what is making his breakdowns work, whether he's chopping, head levering, or elbow pushing. In these first two clips, we're going to see him chop, right? And for his chop to work, he wants to get their elbow or post hand, either one, into the inside of their shoulder. All right, so here we're going to see him transition from a couple different options into this chop. Now he can either get the elbow inside the shoulder by force, getting his hip lift, or using his hip lift to get their body over their elbow, or sometimes the bottom person just has their elbow already inside as he goes to chop. So in this clip, he's attacking right at his elbow. Now as he continues to drive, the opponent's elbow is going to go underneath their body, which will allow him to get his breakdown with a chop. So his elbow is now inside his shoulder. Right, so his bottom person elbow is inside his shoulder. And if he continues to drive, he'll be able to get his breakdown. Right here, we're going to see another chop clip. It's going to be similar things. He transitions from head lever to hand over top to chop. He starts to drive. You see the opponent trying to get their elbow out to the side and braced, but his chop is way more pressure than actually chopping through their arm. So he's kind of planting it in the mat straight down and then taking everything else over the arm as he goes. And again, here's a great example of this backside hip lift to create some pressure over top of that inside arm. See his elbow got inside his shoulder. All right here, elbow inside shoulder, and he continues to drive to get his chop breakdown. In these next two clips, he's going to use an elbow push to break the opponent down. This works by extending the opponent's near side, so their near elbow away from their near knee. So near elbow away from near knee. Trying to get as much space between those two things as possible with this breakdown. All right. So this guy's kind of bracing and not letting him go head lever, and he's got his inside foot up, so it's going to be a little harder to go chop. So he's just going to stay on the elbow and look to push his elbow forward and then take their near leg back as he does this breakdown. So he goes push, starts to extend this opponent's entire near side. So he's extending this way and that way, so forward and back, and then kind of pulling his hips underneath him to get the breakdown. Here's another elbow push. So he rotates over to either go chop or head lever. This guy drops to his elbow, and now his hand's going to rotate back behind, push this arm out as he continues his breakdown, extending their entire near side. Now let's take a look at head lever. This works well when they're bracing on their hand and their elbow is, or their post is like outside their shoulder. Right, so when their post is more outside, kind of bracing for his chop, and he's still up on his hand, it's a good time to look for head lever. So he drops down, hand toward wrist, and again, front knee control or near hip control with his front knee, so he can't get his knee up and out of the way. Changes his direction with his backside hip lift as he continues to do his head lever breakdown. In this clip, similar thing. It's really hard to get a head lever when they drop to their elbow, which is why you'll see him go more either chop or elbow push when they're on their elbow. If they're up on their hand, he most often goes head lever. And again, blocking with front knee, has backside hip control. There's not a whole lot the bottom person can do to stop him from getting the breakdown here. Okay, now let's take a look at a clip where he transitions through each of the 3 breakdowns in some way. Each breakdown of attacking this guy's arm covers the other one's weakness for the most part. All right, so we see him started on this elbow push. All right, now as he continues to move, the guy rotates up to his elbow. We see Spencer Lee's head drop. Maybe he's looking to go chop on that side or head lever. Bottom guy drops back to his elbow to block those options. So he stays elbow push, releases a little bit of pressure. All right. As he starts to rotate back up off this elbow, we see Spencer Lee's head drop back down, looking for a different option to attack this near arm. Elbow push is a little difficult when the guy's braced up on his hand, which is why we'll see him try and transition either chop or head lever. So he rotated back up. He's gonna transition either arm over top or kind of down over. Yep, we see him rotate his hand over top, looking to get that elbow twist to try and get their near elbow to the mat. This guy drops back down, extending his arm almost to his elbow. All right, and again, if there's any kind of extension, elbow push is a good option. So he goes back to behind his elbow to try and push. This guy Spencer Lee tries to transition back into a different option from here. All right, we see him kind of braced up on his arm. So Spencer Lee looks like he's going to try and head lever. All right, so he drops his head behind the arm and looks to rotate his hand to top guy's wrist. Now, top guy does a good job defending by dropping to his elbow. But then we're going to see Spencer Lee transition again, back up the arm, look elbow push. Top guy transition his elbow back up to stop elbow push. And once he rotates back up, he caught him, guys his wrist, head's in position for head lever. All right. Does another great job of rotating back down to his elbow to stop the head lever. Spencer Lee transitions right back over top to go into his chop breakdown. So there's a lot of very small movements until you get just ahead of your opponent's reaction to get your breakdown. And again, it's kind of a triangle where, okay, I go to chop, he braces his arm out to the side, maybe I drop head lever, he drops to his elbow, I go elbow push, he rotates back up, maybe I go back head lever, look to chop again. So they all kind of work together in a way that covers the other one's weakness or the other one's defense. And here we can see another clip. So he goes to rotate head behind. Bottom person feels like he's going to go head lever, so he drops to his elbow. All right. So Spencer Lee feels like head lever's not there. Rotates back from wrist to opponent's elbow. It's going to look to chop. All right, opponent gets his elbow out to the side, away from underneath his body. He transitions arm back behind, looks for elbow push to extend that side. Opponent rotates back up to his hand to try and stop it. Now he rotates back over elbow. And again, sitting away from the attacked arm, I don't think is a great option, because the whole goal of, the whole goal of pretty much Mr. Lee's ride is to get their backside hip higher than their inside hip. So if you're doing that for him, he's probably going to break you down. So backside hip is way above his inside hip. He just goes easy chop, back into a breakdown. Okay, so he's broken him down. Now what? He's still going to look to attack their near side arm to get to one of his turn hold options. So cross wrist or bar, something like that. Most of the time, once he's broken him down, you'll see him start with an elbow push position. You can see his hand rotated behind this person's elbow, looking for elbow push. Now, as the bottom person builds up, we're going to see, all right, if he rotates up with his elbow out, perfect time to head lever. All right, he's coming right up to his hand, his elbow sticking out, and Spencer Lee helps his elbow stick out by pushing it forward. So he's almost behind the guy's tricep and trying to push that elbow forward to make it rotate out when this guy builds up. And then he'll transition to head lever. Guy blocks it, still going elbow push as he rotates up, coming over top, getting the guy to build up again, elbow pushes back into head lever, and then transitions to his bar. Right here we're going to see something similar. Goes elbow push breakdown. All right, again got his elbow push, extending this guy's arm out. Now this guy tries the brace to look to build up. His arm, if we were to look at it from the front, is going to look almost like a 90-degree angle where his elbow is sticking straight up. All right, so Spencer Lee is just going to look to drop his head and attack his elbow with head lever. As he drives over, he's looking to transition to one of his turn holds, which is bar in this case. Let's take a look at another option, which is chop when the guy tries to build up. And this guy understands that if he rotates up to his hand, it's most likely getting head lever. So he wiggles down here because he knows that some kind of trap is being set. All right, so Spencer Lee's still somewhere around the elbow, looking to elbow push or chop, looking to reach underneath if the guy's hand rotates inside, maybe get an inside wrist or cross wrist. All right. And bottom guy's just like, I don't want to build up because you're going to take something away. And then Spencer Lee rotates him over his elbow. So let's go back and take a look. So you see him kind of transition between a couple things. Bottom guy's not really working to build up. As he gets some space underneath the guy's body where he starts to rotate, he can kind of sink this hand deeper and look to get a bigger bite on their backside hip, which will allow him to lift his opponent up and over their own elbow, looking for this chop. So bottom guy starts to build up. Again, gets his hip, outside hip higher than his inside hip, takes him straight over his own elbow, and then most likely transitions right into cross wrist. Okay, here we're going to see something he does when the guy just doesn't build up. So he breaks him down, looks for inside wrist. Now he comes over top of the guy's head and cross reaches, turns his wrist in, looking to get inside wrist, and then transition into cross wrist or some other turn option. There's also, this is fine. I think this is an okay option. I think there is probably a safer option, and it has to do with the goal of the ride. So when he reaches over top with his backside hand this way, he loses the hip control, which again I think is the important part. If he were to keep hip control and then reach over top with his inside hand and attack bottom person's wrist and then turn it in underneath his body, I think that's a better option. And there is a clip of him almost doing it where the guy builds up. Let's see if I can find it. I think it's right here. Yep, so here we see him reach over with same side. All right, in this way he can keep his backside arm underneath, and he's gonna reach over, attack fingers, and really look to turn them in under the opponent's body, and then grab cross wrist or whatever he finds as he turns that hand underneath him. This guy fights it, goes back to elbow push, but those are two options. When the guy refuses to build up off his belly, you can come over top with one of your hands, take their wrist, pull it towards the inside of their body, and then transition to inside wrist, or if he comes over top with his near hand, transition to cross wrist. All right, let's talk about what he can transition to off of attacking this guy's arm in specific ways. So the first one we're going to look at is head lever. This first clip is an option. You don't see him use it much, so he transitions head lever and then rotates the guy's hand up on his back to look hammerlock. I just don't think he likes to turn from this position as much as bar or cross wrist, so that's why I don't think you see him use it a lot. But it is a great way to control the person and make them have to build up. And anytime you have hammerlock, it's a really easy transition to get to his bar or anything like that. So it is an option, but you don't see him use it a lot. More often, he uses head lever straight into armbar. So again, he's going back and forth between elbow push and head lever as the guy builds up. And he goes from wrist, lifts it high to get himself some space, and then transitions right up to an armbar, taking his hand across. The last option from head lever is going to be cross wrist. Now, this happens when the guy's keeping his arm tight to his body. So he's kind of hammerlock here, lets the guy's hand come back down. Now we see the bottom person kind of move his hips in toward his own wrist to try and trap it to his side, trying to avoid giving up an armbar. And Spencer Lee just lets it happen. He pushes his wrist across and is going to reach underneath and grab cross wrist instead of looking for bar here. So those are some of the things he'll transition to off his head lever. Now let's take a look at some of his chop transitions. All right, the most common one is going to be chop into cross wrist. So here we see him chop, gets the guy's arm across his body. Now he's going to look to attack it with what was his hip control hand, and then of course he's got all his turn options from in here, which we'll look at later. Okay, here he's going to go chop into armbar. It's a little head lever-ish. All right, so he chops and the guy's trying to pull his arm out from underneath and away from giving up cross wrist. And as his elbow comes out, we see him create a little bit of space and kind of head lever in order to slip his bar in to look for his bar turn. So he can transition to cross wrist most often from chop, or to bar when they're kind of pulling their arm out and away from the cross wrist. Okay, let's take a look at some of Spencer Lee's armbar turn options, but first let's talk about what can go wrong with your bar, or what are some things that the bottom person can do to kind of defend your armbar. So the first one is so transition to armbar. Now, right here, you have to, as the top person, kind of move your body back over to the other side to secure their elbow, so there's no space between their elbow and their body. But in doing that, you lose the kind of near hip control of this ride. So what can happen is the bottom person can kind of rotate, get both knees in front of your near knee. So we see bottom person's knees have gotten in front of Spencer Lee's knee here, and he can continue to rotate up and in, creating some space away from his body with this armbar, and kind of throwing Spencer Lee off to the side as he tries to pull this armbar back. It's just a good reaction once you've kind of given up the armbar position. Get your knees in front of theirs, kind of rotate in, and then look to score. That's just one thing to be aware of as you're trying to get a bar. The other is, as you start to slip it in, there's still going to be a little bit of space at first. So bottom person can try to limp arm their arm forward as you're trying to run their bar, as you're trying to run your bar to their side. So here we see bottom person kind of roll their shoulder forward and kind of limp arm out. But here Spencer Lee just will transition right back into head lever, which most likely means they're giving up another bar. All right. So there's kind of two ways to counter. Excuse me. There's two things to be aware of when you're punching this bar. So the lower your elbow is or wrist is when you attack the bar, so if it's closer to their wrist, the more leverage you have against their arm, and they won't be able to punch their hand forward. But the lower you are, the more likely they are to try to limp it forward, like we just saw. Now, the higher your elbow is when you attack, so let's say it's up closer to his shoulder as you punch your bar, the less likely they are to limp arm, but the more likely they are to punch their hand forward straight through your bar, taking it kind of over their shoulder. Here we see his elbow is probably just a little bit low, which is why bottom person is able to kind of limp their arm forward. But again, if their elbow is too high, bottom person can punch through their bar. So there's a happy medium between those two spots, kind of, right around the elbow, maybe just above, where it'll be difficult for them to limp arm, but also difficult for them to punch their hand through. There's some things to be aware of as he gets his bar. Okay, so there's this kind of rocking motion that Spencer Lee does when he's running his bar. And I think part of it has to do with the person trying to look away and fight the bar, but I also think part of it is effective in getting your knees in the right spot so they can't sit up into you like we saw earlier, where he kind of got thrown off. So here we see he's got his near shoulder down, and again, I think it's partially due to the bottom person fighting in to try and keep that shoulder down, because eventually you want that shoulder up and taking it over their head. But I think it does a good job where he can get his knees in front of the opponent's knees, and he kind of rocks them a little bit toward that shoulder, and then he'll run back the other direction. So he almost extends that far side when he does this rock motion. So we see him start to run. He rocks him kind of down toward his shoulder. Both the opponent's feet go in the air, which extends that far side, and then he can run back toward their far shoulder, getting height, and he's got his knees in front of his opponents, which means sitting up is going to be really difficult. If you try to sit into this, you're just going to get turned. And again, he's going to go shoulder down, shoulder up, and then straight either over his head or between the opponent's kind of neck and shoulder here. And he's about to turn this one, but then time runs out. But that is extremely tight when he does this kind of rocking motion back and forth. So I'm gonna go back and watch it one more time. All right. Near shoulder down, rocks him up, rolls him back over. Near shoulder down, rocks him up, takes him back over. And that's just a ton of pressure to load the guy up like that. So here we're going to see, okay, so this is a similar position as before, where bottom person got kind of knees in front and some chest height, trying to like turn back into the bar to create some space. A good option to counter this or to reset the position is going half on the backside. We see him start to throw his half in. And then as he continues, he's going to roll all the way through. And then if you have good experience in here, you can look to float straight over and pin the guy, bar half, or completely reset the position back to the opponent's belly. Now let's talk about attacking the opposite side, what he often does and what you can do. So once he gets his bar, at this level, getting an inside wrist is kind of not an option because guys hide their wrist pretty well, or they will wrist roll it out or whatever. So pretty often he will go shoulder hook, which we see right here. He goes shoulder hook, and then he'll transition to like back hook closer to his elbow. So as he starts to run, see him roll over his opponent's hand, where his opponent's hand goes underneath as he drives this direction. And as it rolls over, he's going to transition his shoulder hook to hand between, right in the middle of elbow and shoulder, so just right on his tricep. And then as he runs, this is a really hard position to not go to your back end. Like, there's just nothing to stop you from going over. So most often he goes back hook or shoulder hook into back hook, which we'll see here again. So he's going shoulder hook, kind of looking half shoulder, and again kind of rocking him back and forth. Then goes into his back hook where his hand rotates between the elbow and shoulder on his tricep, and is able to put him on his back in a pretty uncomfortable spot. Another option for your backside hand is a half. So we see him right here, put his half in right in the back of their neck. Now you can really run this two directions, either bar side or half side. He most often will run the half side. I think it's probably easier to turn the guy that way, but it's just going to be straight over the guy's head, kind of looking to stack him for his pin. Now this option, I don't see him use often. I've seen it a couple times, and it's worth mentioning. I'm not even sure what to call this. I was never taught it or really experienced it. So here he has his bar, and he's gonna push, so he goes the opposite side. He's gonna push the opponent's head like underneath his chest. Right. So he pushes his head underneath his chest and then just pulls the bar the opposite direction. and is just gonna pull him over to his back. Again, I've seen him use it a few times. It's not his most common thing, but it's worth mentioning because it is an option. Okay, let's talk about his reinforced bar next. Just it's an arm bar with a cross wrist. There's a few ways to get it. Either he has bar, like in this clip, and the guy tries to build up, which gives him space to reach his hand underneath and across to grab his opponent's wrist. It's one way to get it. Another way is, so bottom guy's kind of staying flat, kind of hiding their wrist, laying on it. He can create some space on his own by rocking to the opposite side, lifting his bar a little bit, walking his hand underneath. We see his hands kind of sneak in right here, coming underneath. And he'll rock him back and forth a little bit until he gets his wrist control where he wants. And then he'll look to turn. Another way is if he has his bar and they're on their base, just looking for their hand to be inside their body. And you can see his hand right here. He just reaches across and grabs it. Fairly simple. Now, there's two directions to tilt his rebar. One is opposite side of the bar. The other one is rolling through on the same side. When he goes opposite side of the bar, he's looking to beat their opposite post, which if the guy reaches in to try and fight his hands, he's basically doing it for him. So he reaches underneath. He has no more post on this side to stop him from turning him. So all he has to do, once he's got his rebar in, dig his knee underneath, starts to dig his knee up and above his hip, drive a little bit. Since there's really not much of a post anymore, his arm got stuck behind. This looks horrible for this guy's arm, but you know, and tilts him up. Another way to turn is rolling through, and then here he doesn't have the rebar yet, he just has cross wrist. All right, but we can see his hand start to sneak in once he rolls through. Starts to sneak into the space, and there he transitions to his rebar for the turn. Now here, bottom guy is fighting out with a post, trying to stop his drive and not get turned. But it's pretty difficult to not eventually collapse your post and then get turned. So he starts to drive up toward that post, getting some height. We can see his post start to shorten. And this is kind of sneaky. I haven't noticed that before. Bottom guy is trying to come in with his foot and take out Spencer Lee's drive leg. Interesting. But doesn't seem to work well, at least in this scenario. Continues to drive. We can see bottom guy's post start to collapse. Starts to get turned. Rocks him up into a tilt. Let's talk about some of his cross-wrist turns. The most common one he does is a roll through. So anytime he can find a little bit of space underneath their near hip, he'll tuck his elbow in and look to roll through tilt. Pretty common, really good tilt, very effective. The other one he does is going opposite side. So you see him try and tuck his head here. Person fights back the other way. He jumps sides and pulls him back into his lap. Drives him over that post, kind of like his rebar tilt, and tilts him on this side. Yeah, let's take a look at some things that kind of counter this ride or can give the top guy more trouble. Again, I think the most important part of the ride is that backside hip lift, where you're trying to get their opposite hip higher than their inside hip. So first thing we're going to look at is someone who is kind of beating that. So we see him, bottom person, rotate knee up and in order to get their outside hip higher, their outside hip lower than their inside hip. So we see inside hip lower than outside hip as he's rotating towards him. It's just really difficult to stay on a chop here. Just the pressure that you can create just isn't the same. So, and we actually see bottom guy do something pretty smart. As he rotates in, he grabs his own leg on the outside so that he doesn't accidentally give up a cross wrist if his hand floats to the inside of his body. So he's holding that inside rotate position. Now he's still trying to rotate in. Now, just because this stuff kind of counters it does not in any way mean it's easy to get away at all. Because as we can see, Spencer Lee is able to do a mat return, follow his roll, and get back on top. Here we see him rotate inside again. As he rotates in now, he's attacking what could give him problems later on if Spencer Lee is able to shift his weight back to the inside. So he's attacking that hip control hand. Again, Spencer Lee does a great job of transitioning to get him back down to the mat, but bottom person still rotating up and in, and again, he gets him back down to the mat. So again, none of this stuff is easy, but it is decent options to try and counter this ride. So here we see Spencer Lee kind of beats him on the whistle, starts to get that hip lift. So we see top hip higher than bottom hip, outside hip higher than inside hip. Now, as he feels this, he rotates, trying to still get back into the side that Spencer Lee's on, but at the same time, he's attacking his opposite hand, the tight waist hand, the hand that I think is the most important for this ride to work. So he's kind of pulling that hand up and off, kind of loosening it just a little bit, just enough to try and get rotated back in. Again, attack his hand, gets bottom hip, outside hip lower than inside hip, starts to rotate up and in, grabbing his outside knee again. Good option to prevent Spencer Lee from pulling the bar all the way back across or giving up cross wrist if his hand floats inside. But again, I don't know if roll's the best option there, because it puts him back in not such a great position. But we can see how that inside rotate, attacking the hip hand, can start to help you create some hip space and some motion to rotate back into the person. Here we're going to see bottom person attack Spencer Lee's opposite elbow or hand and try and pull it up his body. So instead of just peeling the hand off, he's going to try and pull his hand up higher. If he can get his backside hand closer to his armpit, it's going to be less control and less hip lift he can get. So we see him attacking it. He's trying to pull it high, get it off his hip, even though right now his outside hip is higher than his inside hip. Pulling that hand up will allow him to start to rotate that hip back down, as we see there. Now he's able to start to rotate up and in, but again, none of this is easy. Spencer Lee gets his hip, his inside hip back lower than his outside hip. Now, bottom person does something tricky here, or at least pretty good. He takes his hip pressure across Spencer Lee's body, and there's not really a post out here to stop him from knocking him over. He's on his knee, his hands attacking bottom person's elbow. So as he pressures in, he also is hooking Spencer Lee's foot, so he can't necessarily move out to the side as easily. So he pushes him over where he doesn't have a post, and then continues to turn that direction to kind of counter that ride. This one's interesting. I don't know how safe it is, and I don't know if it's the best option every time, but once you're beat on a head lever, so like your arm starts to get pulled back behind your hip where you missed going to your elbow, it might be the best option. I'm not sure, but Spencer Lee's on his outside knee right here, so there's not necessarily a post on this side anymore. As he pulls his arm back, bottom guy is going to block that down knee and then push all his weight across Spencer Lee's body. And again, there's not really any post over here on this side, so he's going to be able to knock him off toward his hip, kind of elevator motion-ish, and kind of looks to go switch or just reach back and attack leg. Again, Spencer Lee stays on top here, ends up actually, I think, putting him in a cradle, possibly. I'm not exactly sure. But it allowed the bottom guy to get off of Spencer Lee's best ride and create some motion. So a few ways to think about to try to counter this ride. And for the top guy, a few things to think about to prevent them from countering the ride or have options to recover after they do some of these things.